Okay, to follow up on the whole sort of colonialism discussion that I was doing last time, when you're looking at colonialism, you have to remember that if you go back to our earlier start of the semester stuff, there's sort of three versions of it. There's the colonialism, where you actually take over a place, usually militarily, you control it completely, you dictate everything that happens there, and you do this to your financial and political whatever advantages. In many cases, excuse me, especially in the late 20th century, this morphed into neocolonialism. And so what you do is you basically give a place sort of provisional independence, but you still control how it operates to a certain extent in the world around it. And you basically still reap the benefits of it, but you don't have the expense of having to protect the place militarily, etc. So the British Commonwealth of the late 20th century was a good example. Canada, Australia, all these places become independent countries, but they're still tied to England completely, intimately, fundamentally, economically, politically, socially, etc. So if you're the UK, you get the huge advantage of still getting all the benefits of having colonies, but you have the added advantage that it's not militarily your problem anymore. They're independent countries; they got to protect themselves. Third phase is what we call post-colonial, and this is where the areas that have been colonized go their own direction. Now, this oftentimes gets very interesting because if the colonizing group has been real aggressive about how much they colonize, then they can end up actually in the future generating their own competition. And the English are the perfect case in point. British go into India by the late 19th century. All of India is under British control. The British mandate that you have to speak English to get an education. The British mandate that the legal system will be the British legal system. The educational system will be the British educational system. And for example, to even be certified as a teacher and such like that, you have to be certified in the English system. Now, what this means is, of course, this is a huge advantage if you're England, because now you not only have, Indians that have to buy all their manufactured goods from England, since India's only going to do basically raw materials, but you're also now sort of the linchpin in their whole sort of intellectual economic system. If someone wants to become a lawyer, for example, in India, you have to go study in England and get your barrister certificate in England to practice in India. If you want to become a teacher at anything other than like an elementary school, you have to get certified in the British system, which means you have to go to school in England. So all of a sudden, places, like the equivalents of shaman, higher education places in England have this huge influx of people trying to get ahead from the colonial areas, Australia, Canada, or in this case, India. If you're wealthy in India, then very quickly what happens by this period is you're going to send your kids to schools in England since English are in charge. So what you find is your British, your elite schools, Eton and places like that end up with large proportions of kids who are, princes in India, whose parents are incredibly wealthy and politically powerful, who send their kid to the top British primary schools, their private schools, to be educated. And so what happens is, to be educated by, say, 1900 in India implies being educated in England. Now, what this means, among other things, to practice law in India, to be a judge in India, you have to be a British lawyer, or I should say trained in England lawyer. And so what happens is everything that's specialized becomes done in England. Everything that's sort of low end, generalized can be done in India. Okay, 1947, the partition takes place. India is now independent. It's an independent country. But you've now had, over 100 years or so of British systems and British controls. So you don't, even though you have independence, you don't write up a whole new legal system. You keep the legal system you've got. So you still find that even today, most Indian judges are trained in England. A large proportion of Indian lawyers are trained as barristers in England, and then they go to work back in India. A lot of your higher education folks are trained in England and go to back to India. So even though the British don't control India anymore, they still reap the benefits of the system they set up that benefited themselves back 100 years ago, still works neocolonialism for them in 2020, 2022. Having said that, what you also get then is by the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, is that British companies that are looking, for example, to provide outsourcing for, telecommunications or say computer systems, something like that, it suddenly dawns on them that you've got this huge pool of Indians who speak English, as their, as their second language in many cases, but they speak it well. They've gone through the British educational system. And so you can hire them for dirt cheap compared to what you'd pay someone in England for the same job, especially if it's, nowadays, if it's, for example, computer support. And so what happens is a lot of the stuff gets outsourced. Now, in the case that I think I mentioned before, like Royal Enfield motorcycles, you move the motorcycle plants to India to supplant the British production. The British production stops any production can Indians. And then what you have is the Indians actually now make the motorcycles that the British originally made and sell them to the Brits. This is post-colonial. So in a weird way, the English reaped the benefits of colonialism in India for 100, 150 years. But now some of that's actually come back to bite them, because now India is actually a competition because India knows them so well because they trained the Indians. This is a big issue when you get into South Asia. This is where a lot of the cheap labor in the world is, along with Southeast Asia. And unlike dealing with the Chinese, a lot of it's in legal systems, which folks, in Europe or North America are familiar with. And so what you're finding is a lot of the cheap production labor that was being done in China till say 4 or 5 years ago is now migrating to Malaysia, which used to be a British colony. It's migrating to Singapore. It's migrating to Thailand, which used to be a semi-French colony. It's migrating to India and Sri Lanka. So what's happening is the post-colonial structure, ironically, the colonial structure the British set up 100, 150 years ago is actually, I don't know if it's working to their advantage per se, but it certainly still has an enormous impact. So a lot of South Asia, when you're looking at South Asia, the colonial period is not just a historical event. It completely changed those societies in many ways. Having said that, other aspects didn't change. And some of the very complicated ones that people tend to forget in North America specifically, since Americans can barely figure out what town they live in, much less the rest of the world, is the fact that when the separation or the partition occurs in 1947, you end up with an enormous amount of bloodshed that occurs as the, country that becomes Pakistan's West and East initially, basically defines itself as a Muslim state. And India defines itself as a non-sectarian state. So like the United States, supposedly religion isn't part of the system, but the reality is it's a Hindu country. And so what happens is, as populations were not set that way physically, because under the British, you weren't allowed some sort of religious segregation. So under the British system, Pakistan and India were one thing, and people lived all over the place. When these places separate, then all of a sudden, this becomes an issue again. And to a certain extent, very quickly, then what you find is their identity gets tied up in religion. Now, as we'll see, the Sikhs get left out of all this, which is a huge sort of complicating factor. But basically, Pakistan becomes a Muslim state, and to a certain extent, being Pakistani defines you as being Muslim. India gets defined pretty much, and in many cases, actually, like certainly the current prime minister likes to define itself as a Hindu state. Now, what happens then is the areas on the border regions, the areas between Pakistan and India, which had the largest sort of mixed populations, end up in this nightmare where people have to decide if they're going to be part of one country or part of another country, when maybe 30, 40% of the population is going one way or the other way. Kashmir is probably the most famous case because the majority population was Muslim, and it's on the border between Pakistan and India. However, the ruling elites in Kashmir were Hindu. And so when the place partitions, they take Kashmir into India, but the majority population wants to go into Pakistan. That war is still going on in 2022, and this is 1947. So that's what, 50, 60, 70, I don't even have enough figures. It's 70 years of civil war, of religiously driven civil war still going on. And it's still a shooting war. India and Pakistan have, I think, 3 wars between them. The last one was about, 6 or 8 years ago. In fact, just 3 or 4 years ago, got in a big shooting match with each other. They're really still technically at war with each other. They sort of have timeouts. It's like North Korea and South Korea, as we'll see. But the reality is they're deadly enemies. Now, what also makes all this very complicated is because they identify with religion, is then fundamentalism, in the sense that I was talking about before when we were talking about the West Asia, becomes an enormous issue, because in many ways that helps to define them. So you find a significant part of the population in India who are Hindu have started to embrace Hindu fundamentalism as a way to make an identity of nation state. Also, even more so in Pakistan, what you find is a significant part of the population has become Muslim fundamentalist as a way to identify nation state. And then, of course, what you have is the two, then they're sharing borders and they like to shoot each other. So you can see where this gets, really bizarre really quickly. Now, on top of that, by the 1970s, both these countries have nuclear weapons. I think that's something the United States tend to almost entirely forget. These are both nuclear powers. And given their tenets of their religion, there's very little that would keep them from pressing a button if they thought they could race the other off the planet with nukes. So we tend to see nuclear weapons, or think of nuclear weapons as being controlled by large, powerful nations that pretty much have a sort of pragmatic view of the world. But the reality is a lot of nuclear weapons are carried by countries like India and Pakistan, who are basically driven as much by religious fervor and fundamentalism as they are sort of the pragmatic impact of what happens if nuclear weapons start being used. So this is something that you really have to keep in mind when you're looking at this region. This is a region where, like West Asia, religion is a tremendously powerful factor. But unlike West Asia, where most of those areas are Muslim, in South Asia, what you find is the fact that you have three basic religions: Islam, the Hindu system, and the Sikhs. Is that religion becomes a huge part of sort of sovereignty, nation state identity, which is one reason why the Sikhs and the Hindus who are together in the country of India have a real hard time getting along. And I'll do that next.